The dust clouds swirled around Camp Bastion like angry spirits as Major Sarah Chun watched the last convoy disappear into the Afghan desert. The date was etched in her memory forever, October 15th, 2021. What was supposed to be a routine withdrawal had turned into a nightmare that would test every fiber of her being and challenge everything she believed about duty, honor, and sacrifice. Sarah had been stationed in Afghanistan for 3 tours of duty, but this assignment was different. She wasn't leading troops into battle or coordinating supply lines. Instead, she served as the liaison officer between the military command and the State Department, helping orchestrate the complex withdrawal of American forces from the region. It was supposed to be her final assignment before retirement, a quiet desk job that would ease her transition back to civilian life after 15 years of service. The morning had started like any other. Sarah reviewed evacuation schedules while sipping bitter coffee from a metal cup that had seen better days. The base buzzed with activity as soldiers packed equipment, destroyed sensitive materials, and prepared for their journey home. After 2 decades of conflict, America was finally leaving Afghanistan, and everyone was eager to put this chapter behind them. But something felt wrong. Sarah noticed discrepancies in the personnel counts that didn't add up. According to her records, 340 Marines from the 2nd Battalion were supposed to have departed on the previous day's convoy. Yet when she cross-referenced the departure manifests with the base roster, those names were nowhere to be found. Her stomach churned as she realized what this meant. She immediately contacted Colonel Williams, the base commander, but was told he was in meetings with Pentagon officials. His aide assured her that all personnel had been accounted for and that any discrepancies were likely administrative errors that would be resolved shortly. Sarah wanted to believe this explanation, but her instincts told her otherwise. She had learned to trust those instincts over years of combat operations. Determined to get answers, Sarah decided to investigate personally. She drove her jeep to the furthest perimeter of the base, where the 2nd Battalion had been stationed. What she found there made her blood run cold. The area was completely abandoned, but signs of recent habitation were everywhere. Personal belongings lay scattered around empty tents. Half-eaten meals sat on makeshift tables, and equipment that should have been packed away was still in place. As she searched through the debris, Sarah found a hastily written note tucked under a rock. The handwriting was barely legible, but she could make out the words, "Orders changed. Told to move to Sector 7 and wait for extraction. No radio contact for 48 hours. Running low on supplies." The note was signed by Sergeant Rodriguez, whom Sarah knew to be a reliable non-commissioned officer. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized the gravity of the situation. Somewhere in the vast Afghan wilderness, 340 Marines were stranded without support, believing they were following legitimate orders. Meanwhile, the official records showed they had already been evacuated. It was a bureaucratic nightmare that could cost lives. She raced back to the command center and demanded to speak with Colonel Williams immediately. When she was told he was unavailable, she pushed past his aide and burst into his office. The colonel was indeed on a video call with Pentagon officials, discussing final withdrawal timelines and congratulating themselves on a successful operation. "Sir, we have a serious problem," Sarah interrupted, knowing she was probably ending her career. 340 Marines are missing, and I believe they're stranded in Sector 7. The video call fell silent. The faces on the screen looked confused and annoyed at the interruption. Colonel Williams glared at Sarah with barely contained fury. "Major Chun, you are out of line. All personnel have been accounted for, and I will not have you spreading panic based on administrative errors." Sarah stood her ground, presenting the evidence she had gathered. She showed them the note, the abandoned camp, and the discrepancies in the records. But the colonel and the Pentagon officials seemed more concerned with maintaining the narrative of a successful withdrawal than investigating her claims. "The official records show those Marines departed yesterday," one of the Pentagon officials stated coldly through the video link. "If there's been some kind of mix-up, it will be sorted out through proper channels. We cannot delay the withdrawal based on unsubstantiated claims." Sarah felt her world crumbling around her. She had devoted her life to the military, believing in its commitment to never leave anyone behind. Yet here she was, watching her superiors dismiss the fate of 340 Marines because it didn't fit their timeline or narrative. As the meeting ended and She was dismissed with a stern warning about proper channels and chain of command. Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. If the military wouldn't save those Marines, she would find a way to do it herself. She had no authority, no resources, and no support. But she had something more valuable, the knowledge of where they might be and the determination to bring them home. That night, as the last official convoys prepared to leave Camp Bastion, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, staring at a map of Sector 7. The area was notorious for its harsh terrain and active insurgent presence. It was no place for stranded troops without proper support or communication. Every hour that passed reduced their chances of survival. She thought about her own family waiting for her back home. Her husband Mark and their 2 children had already planned a welcome home party. Her parents, who had worried about her through 3 deployments, were finally going to see her safe. Walking away from all of that to pursue what others considered a fool's mission would devastate them. But Sarah also thought about the families of those 340 Marines. Somewhere in America, parents, spouses, and children believed their loved ones were safely on their way home. They had no idea that their Marines were fighting for survival in one of the most dangerous places on Earth, abandoned by the very system they had sworn to serve. As dawn broke over the Afghan mountains, Sarah made her choice. She would not abandon those Marines, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had worked for. She began planning what seemed like an impossible mission, locating and extracting 340 stranded Marines from hostile territory with no official support and limited resources. The first step was finding allies. Sarah knew she couldn't do this alone, but she also knew that most military personnel would follow orders rather than risk their careers. She needed to find people who valued honor over hierarchy, who would put the lives of fellow Marines above their own advancement. Her first recruit was Sergeant Major Tommy Jackson, a grizzled veteran who had served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan. Tommy had been scheduled to leave on the final convoy, but Sarah approached him with her evidence and her plan. After studying the materials and asking hard questions, Tommy made his decision. "These boys are Marines," he said simply. "We don't leave Marines behind. Count me in." Next, Sarah contacted Elena Vasquez, a CIA operative who had worked closely with military forces throughout the region. Elena had extensive knowledge of local terrain, insurgent movements, and potential safe routes through Sector 7. Though officially she was supposed to maintain strict protocols, Elena had developed a deep respect for the Marines she had worked with over the years. When Sarah explained the situation, Elena's response was immediate. "Those bureaucrats in Washington have no idea what's happening on the ground. If there are Marines out there, we need to find them before the Taliban does." The small team also included Dr. James Morrison, a military physician who had volunteered to stay behind to help with any medical emergencies during the final withdrawal. When he learned about the missing Marines, he insisted on joining the rescue mission despite Sarah's concerns about putting a non-combatant at risk. "If those boys have been out there for days without proper supplies, they're going to need medical attention," Dr. Morrison argued. "I took an oath to do no harm, and leaving them to die would violate everything I believe in." As the official military presence at Camp Bastion dwindled to almost nothing, Sarah's small team prepared for their unauthorized mission. They gathered supplies, studied maps, and planned routes while staying hidden from the remaining command structure. Every moment they delayed meant less chance of finding the Marines alive, but rushing in without proper preparation would only result in more casualties. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Sarah's shoulders like a physical force. She had gone from following orders to giving them, from being part of a vast military machine to leading a small group of volunteers on what many would consider a suicide mission. The irony wasn't lost on her that in order to save Marines, she had to become a rogue operator herself. As night fell on what would be their last evening at Camp Bastion, Sarah gathered her team for a final briefing. They huddled around a map spread out on a makeshift table, their faces illuminated by a single lamp that cast long shadows on the walls. "Tomorrow we head into Sector 7, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "We have no official support, no backup, and no guarantee we'll find them alive. Anyone who wants to change their mind can walk away now with no judgment." The silence that followed was profound. Each team member looked at the others, understanding that they were about to cross a line from which there might be no return. They were soldiers and operatives trained to follow orders, but they were also human beings who couldn't ignore their conscience. Sergeant Major Jackson spoke first. "Ma'am, I've been a Marine for 22 years. I've never left a fellow Marine behind, and I'm not starting now." Elena nodded firmly. "Those boys didn't choose to be abandoned. Someone needs to choose to save them." Dr. Morrison adjusted his glasses and smiled grimly. "I became a doctor to save lives. This is what I'm supposed to do." Sarah felt a surge of pride and terror as she realized there was no turning back. Tomorrow, they would venture into one of the most dangerous regions in Afghanistan, searching for 340 Marines who might already be dead. They would be outnumbered, outgunned, and operating without any official sanction. But they would be doing what they believed was right, regardless of the consequences. The last convoy had left hours ago, taking with it the final official American military presence in the region. Camp Bastion, which had been a bustling center of operations just days before, now stood nearly empty. In the morning, Sarah and her team would lock the gates behind them and disappear into the Afghan wilderness, chasing shadows and hope in equal measure. As they finalized their preparations and tried to get some rest, each team member grappled with their own fears and motivations. They were about to embark on a mission that defied orders, endangered their careers, and risked their lives. But they were also about to prove that sometimes the most important battles are fought by those willing to stand alone for what they believe is right. The sun barely peeked over the Afghan mountains when Sarah's team departed Camp Bastion for what they all knew might be a one-way journey. Their convoy consisted of 2 armored vehicles loaded with supplies, medical equipment, communication gear, and enough ammunition to fight their way through hostile territory. The vehicles had been officially decommissioned from military service, but were still functional enough for their desperate mission. Sarah rode in the lead vehicle, studying satellite maps while Elena navigated using her intimate knowledge of the terrain. Behind them, Sergeant Major Jackson maintained radio watch, hoping to pick up any communications from the missing Marines. Dr. Morrison checked and rechecked his medical supplies, preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. The journey to Sector 7 would take them through some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. The region was known for its rugged mountains, hidden valleys, and strong Taliban presence. Even during the height of American military operations, Sector 7 had been considered too risky for routine patrols. Now, with most coalition forces gone, it had become a virtual no-man's land. As they drove deeper into hostile territory, Elena shared what she knew about recent Taliban movements in the area. Intelligence reports suggested that several insurgent groups had moved into the vacuum left by departing American forces. These groups were well-armed, highly motivated, and eager to capture American soldiers who could be used as propaganda tools or bargaining chips. If the Marines are still alive, they're probably holed up somewhere defensible, Elena explained, pointing to various locations on the map. There are several abandoned compounds in Sector 7 that could provide temporary shelter. The problem is reaching them before the Taliban does. The first checkpoint came sooner than expected. As they rounded a bend in the mountain road, they encountered a makeshift roadblock manned by local militia fighters. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized they were no longer under the protection of official military status. They were now just 4 Americans in hostile territory with no backup and no diplomatic immunity. Elena took the lead in negotiations, using her fluency in local languages and her understanding of regional politics. She presented the fighters with a cover story about being part of a humanitarian mission, delivering medical supplies to remote villages. The militia fighters seemed suspicious, but were ultimately convinced by Dr. Morrison's obvious medical equipment and Elena's authoritative demeanor. After tense negotiations and a small bribe, the team was allowed to pass. But the encounter served as a stark reminder of how vulnerable they had become. Every mile they traveled took them further from safety and deeper into a region where their presence would be met with hostility. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as they entered the heart of Sector 7. Rocky mountain paths replaced proper roads, forcing them to drive slowly while constantly watching for ambushes. The vehicle's armor plating provided some protection, but Sarah knew that determined attackers with the right weapons could easily disable their convoy. Around midday, they reached the coordinates where Sarah believed the Marines had been ordered to wait. The location was a strategic valley that provided good defensive positions, but was also isolated enough to be easily overlooked by extraction teams. As they approached the designated area, Sergeant Major Jackson suddenly held up his hand for silence. "I'm picking up something on the radio," he whispered, adjusting his equipment. Static filled the air, but through the noise came faint voices speaking English. The transmission was broken and difficult to understand, but certain words came through clearly. Day 5. Running low, medical attention needed. The team exchanged excited glances. After days of uncertainty, they had proof that at least some of the Marines were still alive. But the transmission also revealed that their situation was desperate. 5 days without proper supplies in hostile territory would have taken a severe toll on even the most elite soldiers. Elena used her binoculars to scan the surrounding ridges while Sarah plotted their approach route. The valley was too exposed for a direct assault, and they needed to locate the exact position of the Marines before making contact. A wrong move could alert enemy forces or trigger a firefight that would endanger everyone involved. As afternoon turned to evening, they established a temporary observation post on a ridge overlooking the valley. Through careful surveillance, they finally spotted signs of the missing Marines, smoke from a carefully concealed fire, movement among the rocks, and what appeared to be a defensive perimeter around an abandoned building complex. "There they are," Elena breathed, passing the binoculars to Sarah. "Looks like they've fortified an old compound about 2 kilometers down the valley. Smart positioning, good fields of fire, and multiple escape routes." Sarah studied the Marine positions through the binoculars, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because they had found the missing soldiers alive. Dread because she could see how precarious their situation had become. The compound was surrounded by high ground that could easily be used by attackers. Worse, there appeared to be enemy movement on the opposite ridge. "We're not the only ones who found them," Sergeant Major Jackson observed grimly. "Taliban scouts have been watching that position for at least an hour. They're probably planning an assault." The situation had become a race against time. Sarah's small team needed to reach the Marines and organize an extraction before Taliban forces could mount a full attack. But any hasty move could trigger the very assault they were trying to prevent. As darkness fell, Sarah made the difficult decision to approach the Marine position under cover of night. It would be dangerous. Friendly fire incidents were common in low-visibility situations, but waiting until morning would likely mean finding only bodies. Elena led the way, using her night vision equipment and knowledge of local terrain to guide them through the rocky landscape. Dr. Morrison stayed with the vehicles, ready to provide medical support once they made contact with the Marines. Sergeant Major Jackson carried the team's communication equipment, hoping to establish radio contact before they got close enough to be shot by nervous sentries. The approach took hours of careful movement through treacherous terrain. Every sound seemed amplified in the mountain air, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as they navigated around loose rocks and hidden crevices. One misstep could send an avalanche of stones down the mountainside, alerting every enemy fighter in the area to their presence. When they were still several hundred meters from the Marine position, Jackson finally managed to establish radio contact. His voice was barely a whisper as he transmitted on emergency frequencies. "Outpost 7, this is Rescue Alpha. We are American personnel approaching your position from the north. Do not engage." The response came immediately, filled with excitement and disbelief. "Rescue Alpha, this is Outpost 7 actual. Confirm you are American military? We have been waiting for extraction for 5 days." Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she listened to the radio exchange. The Marines were alive, alert, and maintaining discipline despite their desperate situation. But their relief was tempered by the urgency in the Marine commander's voice when he reported enemy activity. "Be advised, we have observed significant Taliban movement in the area. Estimate 50 to 70 fighters positioning for assault. We are low on ammunition and have several wounded personnel requiring immediate medical evacuation." The numbers hit Sarah like a physical blow. 50 to 70 Taliban fighters against 340 Marines who were running low on supplies and ammunition. Even elite Marines would struggle against those odds in their current condition. Sarah's small rescue team would barely tip the scales, but they had to try. As they finally reached the marine perimeter, Sarah was shocked by what she found. The soldiers she encountered were gaunt, dehydrated, and clearly suffering from days of inadequate rations and constant stress. Many showed signs of minor injuries that had not received proper medical attention. Despite their condition, they maintained military discipline and continued to man their defensive positions. Captain Rodriguez, the senior Marine officer, briefed Sarah on their situation. His unit had received orders to move to Sector 7 and establish a temporary observation post while waiting for extraction. When extraction didn't come as scheduled, they had tried to contact headquarters but found their communications equipment malfunctioning. By the time they realized something was wrong, Taliban forces had moved into the area, cutting off their escape routes. "We've been rationing food and water, but we'll be out of both within 24 hours, Captain Rodriguez reported. "Several men need immediate medical attention, and our ammunition is down to basic combat loads. We can hold this position for maybe one more assault, but that's it." Dr. Morrison immediately began treating the wounded Marines while Sarah, Elena, and Jackson assessed the tactical situation. The compound provided good defensive positions, but it was also a trap. The Taliban controlled the high ground and could prevent any attempt to break out in daylight. Their only chance was to organize a nighttime withdrawal before enemy forces could coordinate a major assault. Elena used her contacts among local informants to gather intelligence on Taliban movements and intentions. What she learned was disturbing. The insurgents had identified the Marine position and were bringing in reinforcements from across the region. They saw the isolated American soldiers as a valuable prize and were determined to capture or eliminate them. "We're looking at a coordinated attack sometime before dawn," Elena reported. "They're moving heavy weapons into position and have brought in their best fighters. This isn't just a local militia. These are experienced Taliban veterans who know how to conduct siege warfare." Sarah realized that their rescue mission had evolved into something much more complex and dangerous. They couldn't simply evacuate the Marines under current conditions. Instead, they needed to either break the Taliban siege or hold the position until additional help could arrive. Both options seemed nearly impossible given their limited resources. As midnight approached, the situation deteriorated further. Taliban fighters had moved close enough to begin probing attacks, testing the Marine defenses with small arms fire and mortars. Each attack was brief but served to wear down the defenders and reduce their remaining ammunition. During a lull in the fighting, Sarah gathered her team and the Marine leadership for a strategy session. They spread maps on the floor of the compound's main building, marking known enemy positions and potential escape routes. The options were all bad, but some were worse than others. "We have 3 choices," Sarah explained. "First, we try to break out tonight and fight our way to the vehicles. Second, we hold this position and hope for reinforcements that may never come. Third, we split into smaller groups and try to evade capture while making our way to friendly territory." Captain Rodriguez shook his head at the third option. "Ma'am, we don't leave Marines behind. Whatever we do it together." Elena pointed to a narrow valley that led away from the compound toward the east. "This route might work for a breakout, but we'd have to move fast and quiet. The Taliban probably have it covered, but it's our best chance." Dr. Morrison raised a critical concern. "What about the wounded? We have 15 Marines who can't move quickly and 3 who can barely walk. Any breakout plan has to account for them." The weight of command had never felt heavier on Sarah's shoulders. Every decision she made would determine whether 340 Marines lived or died. She had no authority to be making these choices, no training in large-scale tactical operations, and no support from higher command. But she was the senior officer present, and that made these decisions hers to make. As she studied the maps and listened to the distant sound of enemy fighters moving through the darkness, Sarah realized that conventional military thinking might not be enough. They needed something unexpected, something the Taliban wouldn't anticipate. Looking at Elena's intelligence reports and the terrain maps, an idea began to form in her mind. "What if we don't try to avoid the Taliban?" Sarah asked quietly. "What if we bring the fight to them?" The room fell silent as everyone processed this unexpected suggestion. Rather than running from superior enemy forces, Sarah was proposing to attack them. It seemed like madness, but, as she explained her reasoning, the others began to understand her logic. The Taliban expected the Americans to either hide in the compound or attempt a defensive withdrawal. They would not expect a small force to launch an aggressive assault against their positions. A well-coordinated attack could disrupt their siege preparations and create enough confusion for the main Marine force to break out. It's incredibly risky, Elena admitted, but it might be crazy enough to work. As dawn approached, and the sound of enemy preparations grew louder, Sarah's team finalized their desperate plan. They would split into two groups. A small assault team would attack the main Taliban position to create a distraction, while the larger group of Marines would execute a fighting withdrawal toward the vehicles. Success would require perfect timing, absolute courage, and more than a little luck. But, as Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her fellow soldiers, Americans who had volunteered for an impossible mission because it was the right thing to do, she felt a surge of confidence. They had already accomplished the impossible by finding the missing Marines. Now they just had to accomplish the impossible again by getting everyone home alive. The pre-dawn darkness felt heavy with anticipation as Sarah's assault team prepared for what many believed would be their final mission. Elena had identified the Taliban command post on the western ridge, approximately 800 meters from the Marine compound. The position contained the enemy's communication equipment and senior leadership. Destroying it would create chaos among the Taliban forces and buy precious time for the main evacuation. Sarah's assault team consisted of herself, Elena, Sergeant Major Jackson, and 12 Marines handpicked by Captain Rodriguez. They were the strongest and most experienced fighters available, but even they looked worn down by days of siege conditions. Their faces were gaunt from limited rations, and their equipment showed signs of constant use. But their determination remained unshakable. Dr. Morrison would remain with the main group to treat wounded Marines during the withdrawal. Captain Rodriguez would lead the evacuation toward the vehicles while Sarah's team created their diversion. The timing had to be perfect, too early, and the Taliban would recover before the Marines could escape. Too late, and the evacuation force would be caught in the open. As the first hint of dawn appeared on the horizon, Sarah checked her watch one final time. In 30 minutes, they would launch an attack that defied every principle of tactical warfare she had ever learned. Attacking uphill against superior numbers was exactly what military academies taught you never to do, but sometimes desperate situations required desperate measures. Elena led them through the darkness using routes she had scouted during her years of intelligence work in the region. The path wound through rocky outcroppings and dry creek beds, providing concealment, but making movement slow and treacherous. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid dislodging stones that could alert enemy sentries. As they approached the Taliban position, the sounds of enemy activity became clearer. Voices speaking in Pashto drifted down from the ridge, along with the metallic sounds of weapons being prepared and equipment being moved. Sarah estimated at least 20 fighters in the immediate area, with more positioned along the ridgeline. Through her night vision scope, Elena identified key targets: the communication equipment, ammunition storage areas, and the building where Taliban leadership appeared to be meeting. The assault would need to hit all three objectives simultaneously to maximize chaos and prevent coordinated resistance. "Remember, we're not trying to win a battle," Sarah whispered to her team during their final briefing. "We're trying to create enough confusion to buy time for the evacuation. Hit hard, hit fast, and then get out." Sergeant Major Jackson positioned his Marines to provide covering fire while Sarah and Elena approached the main objectives. The plan was simple but required perfect execution. Explosive charges would destroy the communication equipment and ammunition storage, while targeted fire would eliminate key personnel and create panic among the remaining fighters. At exactly 0530 hours, Sarah gave the signal to begin the attack. The mountain silence shattered as explosions rocked the Taliban position. Elena's charges destroyed the communication array in a shower of sparks and debris, while Jackson's Marines opened fire on predetermined targets with devastating accuracy. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Taliban fighters, awakened from sleep or distracted from their morning preparations, scrambled for cover as bullets and explosions erupted around them. Shouts of confusion and alarm filled the air as commanders tried to understand what was happening and organize a response. Sarah moved through the chaos like a force of nature, her training and adrenaline combining to give her superhuman focus and speed. She eliminated 3 fighters who were attempting to set up a heavy machine gun that could have devastated the evacuating Marines. Behind her, Elena systematically destroyed weapons caches and equipment stores with precisely placed charges. The assault team's surprise advantage lasted only minutes before the Taliban began to organize their defense. Superior numbers and familiarity with the terrain allowed them to establish overlapping fields of fire that made movement increasingly dangerous. Sarah realized they had achieved their primary objective, creating chaos, but needed to withdraw before being overwhelmed. Alpha Team, this is Chun, she radioed to Captain Rodriguez. Package delivered. Beginning withdrawal. You are clear to move. The response came immediately. Copy that. All units, this is Rodriguez. Execute withdrawal plan now. Move, move, move. 2 kilometers away, Captain Rodriguez led 340 Marines in a fighting withdrawal toward the vehicles Sarah's team had left hidden in a narrow valley. The wounded Marines were carried by their comrades, slowing the movement, but maintaining the fundamental Marine principle that no one gets left behind. The evacuation route led through terrain that favored defenders, but the Marines used their training and discipline to maintain security while moving quickly. Point teams cleared obstacles and potential ambush sites while rear guards prevented pursuit. Despite their exhausted condition, the Marines moved with the precision of elite soldiers. Meanwhile, Sarah's assault team found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. Taliban reinforcements were converging on their position from multiple directions, drawn by the sounds of battle. The element of surprise was gone, and they were now severely outnumbered in an exposed position. We need to move now, Elena shouted over the sound of incoming fire. They're bringing up mortars. The team began a fighting retreat down the mountainside, using every piece of cover available while Taliban fighters pressed their pursuit. Sergeant Major Jackson's Marines provided disciplined covering fire that allowed their teammates to bound from position to position, but ammunition was running low and the enemy was closing in. Sarah felt a burning sensation in her left shoulder as a bullet grazed her, but she pushed through the pain and continued moving. Around her, 2 Marines had been wounded but were still fighting effectively. Elena had taken shrapnel from a mortar explosion but refused medical attention until they reached safety. The pursuit continued for over an hour as both groups raced through the rugged terrain. Sarah's team had the advantage of speed and mobility, but the Taliban had superior knowledge of the area and could use shortcuts to try to cut them off. Several times, the Americans found their route blocked and had to fight through enemy positions or find alternative paths. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah began to worry about the main evacuation group. Radio contact was sporadic due to the mountainous terrain, and she had no way of knowing whether Captain Rodriguez had successfully reached the vehicles. If the evacuation had failed, her assault team's sacrifice would be meaningless. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of running and fighting, they spotted the vehicles hidden in the valley below. Sarah's heart leaped with joy as she saw Marines loading wounded personnel while others established a defensive perimeter. The evacuation was proceeding, but slowly due to the number of injured personnel requiring medical attention. Dr. Morrison was everywhere at once, moving from casualty to casualty with calm efficiency despite the chaos around him. His medical training and experience were literally saving lives as he stabilized wounded Marines for transport. Several soldiers who would have died from their injuries were kept alive by his skilled intervention. Doc's been working miracles, Captain Rodriguez reported as Sarah's team reached the vehicles. We've got the vehicles loaded and ready to move, but some of these boys are in bad shape. The sooner we get them to a proper medical facility, the better. Sarah looked around at the scene and felt a surge of pride mixed with deep concern. They had found the missing Marines and organized an evacuation, but they were far from safe. The vehicles were loaded beyond capacity with wounded personnel and supplies, which would slow their movement significantly. Taliban forces would certainly pursue once they realized what had happened. Elena studied her maps while monitoring radio intercepts from Taliban communications. What she heard was ominous. Enemy forces were coordinating a pursuit and had already dispatched fast-moving units to intercept the American convoy on the main roads leading out of Sector 7. "They know we're here, and they know where we're going," Elena reported. "The main routes are compromised. We'll have to take the long way around, through terrain that's barely passable for vehicles. The alternate route would add hours to their journey and take them through some of the most difficult terrain in the region. The vehicles were already straining under their heavy loads, and mechanical breakdowns in hostile territory could be catastrophic. But the main roads were certain death traps." As they prepared to depart, Dr. Morrison approached Sarah with grim news about several critically wounded Marines. "Ma'am, these men need surgery within the next few hours, or they're not going to make it. The evacuation is saving lives, but we're racing against time." Sarah felt the crushing weight of command as she realized that every decision she made would determine who lived and died. Moving quickly might save the critically wounded, but could expose everyone to Taliban ambushes. Moving cautiously might avoid enemy contact, but could cost the lives of Marines who needed immediate medical care. Looking at the faces around her, American soldiers who trusted her leadership despite having no official reason to do so, Sarah made her decision. They would take the dangerous route, but move as quickly as possible, accepting the risks in order to save the wounded. The convoy began moving through terrain that challenged even experienced mountain drivers. Rocky paths barely wide enough for their vehicles wound through narrow valleys and across exposed ridges where enemy fire could come from any direction. The Marines not driving or receiving medical care maintained constant watch for Taliban fighters who might try to ambush the slow-moving vehicles. Progress was agonizingly slow as they navigated around obstacles and through areas where the vehicles had to be carefully maneuvered to avoid rolling over or becoming stuck. Several times, Marines had to dismount and guide the drivers through particularly treacherous sections while others provided security. Despite the difficult conditions, morale among the Marines remained surprisingly high. After days of being abandoned and forgotten, they were finally on their way home. The knowledge that fellow Americans had risked everything to find them created a bond that transcended normal military hierarchy. Sarah found herself no longer just giving orders, but being accepted as part of the extended Marine family. As afternoon turned to evening, the convoy finally reached more stable terrain that allowed faster movement. But Elena's radio intercepts revealed that Taliban forces had accurately predicted their route and established roadblocks ahead. The enemy had used their knowledge of local terrain to position forces that could cut off the American escape. "We've got problems," Elena announced grimly. "They're waiting for us at the junction with Highway 7. At least 30 fighters with heavy weapons, positioned to catch us in a crossfire when we try to pass." Sarah studied the map desperately, looking for alternatives that might allow them to bypass the roadblock. But the terrain channeled all traffic through the junction. There was no way around it. They would have to fight their way through or find some other solution. Captain Rodriguez suggested splitting the convoy, sending the wounded ahead in one vehicle while the fighters engaged the roadblock. But Sarah rejected this plan because it would leave the wounded defenseless if they encountered additional Taliban forces. As they approached the area where the roadblock was positioned, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of trying to fight through or go around the Taliban position, she would attempt to negotiate safe passage. It was a desperate gamble that could result in their capture or death, but it might also be their only chance to save the wounded Marines. "Elena, can you get us a meeting with their commander?" Sarah asked. "I want to talk to them." Elena looked shocked. "Ma'am, these aren't reasonable people. They're Taliban fighters who would love nothing more than to capture American soldiers." "Maybe," Sarah replied. "But they're also people who understand the concept of honor and the treatment of wounded. It's worth trying before we start a fight we might not win." As the convoy stopped short of the roadblock, Sarah prepared for the most important negotiation of her life. The lives of 340 Marines hung in the balance, and everything depended on her ability to find common ground with an enemy who had every reason to see her as a target rather than a negotiator. The tension was suffocating as Sarah walked alone toward the Taliban roadblock, her hands visible and empty, carrying only a white piece of cloth torn from her uniform. Behind her, 340 Marines watched in stunned silence as their rescuer attempted what seemed impossible, negotiating with an enemy that had shown no mercy throughout 20 years of conflict. Elena had managed to establish radio contact with the Taliban commander, a man known locally as Commander Ahmadi. Through careful questioning, she learned that he was an educated former government official who had joined the Taliban after losing family members in coalition airstrikes. Unlike many fighters motivated purely by religious extremism, Ahmadi seemed to operate according to a code of honor that might allow for negotiation. As Sarah approached the Taliban position, she could see dozens of fighters positioned behind rocks and vehicles, their weapons trained on her convoy. The roadblock was professionally constructed and well defended. Attacking it would result in massive casualties, even if they ultimately succeeded in breaking through. Commander Ahmadi emerged from behind a large boulder, flanked by 2 bodyguards but maintaining the respectful distance appropriate for a parley under arms. He was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes that assessed her carefully as she approached. "You are the American woman who leads these soldiers?" he asked in accented but clear English. "I am Major Sarah Chun, United States Marine Corps," she replied formally. "I am responsible for these Marines." Ahmadi nodded slowly. "I am Commander Ahmadi. My men tell me you attacked our position this morning with great skill and courage. They also tell me you carry wounded among your force." Sarah was surprised by his directness and apparent willingness to engage in actual dialogue rather than simply demanding surrender. She decided to match his straightforward approach with honesty about their situation. "We have 15 critically wounded Marines who will die without immediate medical care," she said. "I am asking for safe passage to allow us to evacuate them to proper medical facilities." The Taliban commander studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth or attempting some form of deception. Around them, the mountain air was still except for the distant sound of vehicles and the quiet conversations of fighters maintaining their positions. "These wounded soldiers," Ahmadi said finally. "They are the same men who came to our country to kill our people and destroy our homes." Sarah felt her temper flare, but forced herself to remain calm. Any sign of anger or aggression could end the negotiation before it truly began. Instead, she chose to address his question with the complexity it deserved. "They are soldiers who followed orders and serve their country, just as your fighters follow orders and serve their beliefs," she replied. "But, right now, they are not soldiers. They are wounded men who need medical help. Some are barely more than boys." Ahmadi's expression softened slightly at this admission. He looked back toward the convoy, where the outlines of Marines could be seen moving around the vehicles, some clearly supporting wounded comrades. "Why should I care about the lives of American soldiers?" he asked, but his tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than hostility. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision to speak from her heart rather than from military doctrine. "Because showing mercy to wounded enemies is what separates civilized people from barbarians. Because your faith teaches compassion for the suffering. And because someday, your fighters may be wounded and need the same mercy from their enemies." The Taliban commander was quiet for several minutes, obviously wrestling with the decision. Around them, both American and Taliban fighters maintained their positions but watched the negotiation with intense interest. Everyone understood that the next few minutes would determine whether the standoff ended in bloodshed or unexpected cooperation. Elena's voice crackled through Sarah's radio earpiece. "Intercepted communications suggest other Taliban units are moving to surround us. Whatever's going to happen needs to happen fast." Sarah realized she was running out of time. If Commander Ahmadi didn't make a decision soon, the choice would be made for him by reinforcements that might not share his apparent willingness to negotiate. "Commander," she said urgently, "I offer you something in return for safe passage." Ahmadi raised an eyebrow with interest. "What could you possibly offer that would be worth the lives of American soldiers?" Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew a small device that caused several Taliban fighters to raise their weapons nervously. But, instead of a weapon, she held out a GPS unit containing detailed information about Taliban positions and movements that her team had observed during their time in Sector 7. Intelligence, she said simply. Detailed information about the movements and positions of other American forces in the region. Information that could save the lives of your fighters. The offer was technically a violation of military protocol, but Sarah rationalized that the information was already outdated since official American forces had withdrawn from the area. More importantly, the intelligence might prevent future battles that would cost lives on both sides. Commander Amadi examined the device carefully, his expression revealing both surprise and grudging respect. You would betray your own forces to save your wounded. The forces this information concerns are no longer in the region, Sarah replied. But, yes, I would do whatever necessary to save these Marines. The Taliban commander made his decision with the speed of a man accustomed to command. You will leave your weapons here and proceed to the junction with only your wounded and medical personnel. Your fighting men will remain as my guests until you reach safety and can arrange for a prisoner exchange. Sarah's heart sank as she realized Amadi was essentially demanding hostages to ensure the wounded Marines reached safety. It was a reasonable precaution from his perspective, but it meant leaving healthy Marines in Taliban custody with uncertain prospects for release. I can't agree to that, she said firmly. We don't abandon our people. Then, we have no agreement, Amadi replied, turning to walk back toward his positions. Wait, Sarah called out desperately. There has to be another way. The Taliban commander paused and looked back at her. You spoke of honor and mercy. Those concepts require trust. But how can I trust Americans who have broken promises for 20 years? Sarah understood that she was being offered a test of her sincerity and leadership. Amadi was asking her to demonstrate her commitment to saving the wounded Marines by accepting personal risk. After a moment of internal struggle, she made her choice. I'll stay, she said quietly. Let all my Marines go wounded and healthy. I'll remain as your hostage until you're satisfied they've reached safety. The offer clearly surprised Commander Amadi, who had obviously expected her to reject any proposal that involved leaving Americans behind. He studied her face again, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. You would sacrifice yourself for your soldiers? He asked. That's what leaders do, Sarah replied simply. The Taliban commander nodded slowly, apparently recognizing something familiar in her willingness to accept personal sacrifice for her subordinates. Very well. You will remain here with 5 of your Marines as guarantee of good faith. When your wounded reach safety, and contact us by radio, you and your men will be released to return to your people. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror as she realized the negotiation was actually working. The wounded Marines would get the medical care they desperately needed, and the healthy fighters would avoid a battle they might not survive. The price was her own freedom and that of 5 volunteers, but it seemed like an acceptable trade. Elena approached as Sarah returned to the convoy to explain the agreement. The CIA operative looked deeply troubled by the arrangement, but understood the logic behind it. It's the best deal we're going to get, Elena acknowledged. But once you're in their custody, there's no guarantee they'll honor their word about releasing you. Captain Rodriguez was even more direct in his objections. Ma'am, we don't leave Marines behind. That's fundamental. We can fight our way through this roadblock. Sarah gathered her Marines for a final briefing, explaining the terms Amadi had offered and the reasoning behind her decision to accept them. The faces around her showed a mixture of admiration, concern, and anger as they processed what she was asking them to do. I need 5 volunteers to stay with me, she announced. The rest of you will escort the wounded to safety and then arrange for our release through whatever diplomatic channels still exist. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every healthy Marine stepped forward, volunteering to stay behind with their leader. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized these soldiers were willing to sacrifice their own freedom to share her risk. I'll stay, Sergeant Major Jackson said immediately. You'll need experienced NCO leadership. Elena volunteered next. My contacts in the region might be helpful if negotiations become complicated. Dr. Morrison surprised everyone by also volunteering. If there are wounded among the Taliban fighters, medical assistance might help ensure good treatment for our people. Sarah selected her 5 volunteers based on their skills and the likelihood that their expertise might prove valuable during captivity. The others would accompany the wounded Marines to safety, carrying with them the responsibility to arrange for the release of their comrades. The handover proceeded with surprising professionalism on both sides. Taliban fighters provided vehicles for the wounded Marines, while American personnel transferred medical supplies and equipment. Dr. Morrison briefed his replacement on the condition of each patient and the treatment they would require during transport. As the convoy carrying the wounded Marines disappeared around a bend in the mountain road, Sarah and her 5 volunteers were escorted to a compound hidden in a narrow valley. The facility was well established, with communications equipment, supply depots, and accommodations that suggested long-term occupation. Commander Ahmadi proved to be an honorable captor who treated his prisoners according to international conventions despite having no obligation to do so. The Americans were provided with adequate food, medical care for their minor wounds, and even access to communications equipment to contact their superiors and arrange for release. The negotiations for their freedom took 3 days of complex discussions involving multiple governments, international organizations, and tribal leaders. Sarah spent the time learning about Ahmadi's background and motivations, discovering that he was a far more complex individual than she had initially assumed. During one conversation, the Taliban commander revealed that he had lost his entire family, wife, children, and parents in an errant coalition airstrike that hit the wrong building. His transformation from government bureaucrat to Taliban fighter was motivated not by religious extremism, but by personal grief and a desire for revenge against those who had destroyed his life. "I do not hate all Americans," he explained during one of their talks. "But I cannot forget what your forces took from me. When I saw your willingness to sacrifice yourself for your wounded soldiers, I recognized something I had forgotten, that honor exists on both sides of this conflict." On the 3rd day, radio contact confirmed that all wounded Marines had reached American medical facilities and were receiving proper treatment. Several would require extensive surgery and rehabilitation, but all would survive thanks to the evacuation and Dr. Morrison's field treatment. True to his word, Commander Ahmadi released Sarah and her volunteers at the same crossroads where their convoy had been stopped. The Taliban fighters who had captured them 3 days earlier now provided them with transportation and safe conduct back to coalition territory. As they drove away from the compound, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened since she first discovered the discrepancies in the evacuation records. What had started as a bureaucratic concern had evolved into an unauthorized rescue mission that ultimately saved 340 Marines from abandonment and death. The official military response to her actions was complicated and controversial. Some superiors praised her initiative and courage, while others criticized her for operating outside proper channels and risking an international incident. The fact that her mission had succeeded probably saved her from court-martial, but it also ended her military career. Sarah received an honorable discharge rather than the retirement she had originally planned, but she felt no regret about the choice she had made. At the ceremony recognizing her actions, she was surrounded by Marines whose lives had been saved by her decision to act when others would not. Captain Rodriguez, now fully recovered from his ordeal, spoke at the ceremony. "Major Chen didn't just save our lives. She proved that the Marine Corps values of honor, courage, and commitment aren't just words on a wall. They're principles worth risking everything to uphold." Elena received recognition for her intelligence work and her role in the negotiations that secured everyone's safe return. Sergeant Major Jackson was promoted and assigned to train other non-commissioned officers in leadership under extreme circumstances. Dr. Morrison received a commendation for his medical expertise that saved multiple lives under combat conditions. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Months after their release, Sarah received a letter written in careful English from Commander Ahmadi. In it, he thanked her for reminding him that honor and compassion could exist even between enemies. He reported that her example had influenced his own treatment of prisoners and his approach to the ongoing conflict. The letter concluded with words that Sarah would treasure for the rest of her life. "You showed me that true leadership means being willing to sacrifice everything for those under your command. This is a lesson that transcends nationality, religion, or politics. It is simply human." As Sarah began her new life as a civilian, She often thought about those 3 days in the Afghan mountains when everything she believed about duty, honor, and sacrifice had been tested. She had risked her career, her freedom, and her life because she couldn't accept the abandonment of fellow Americans. In the end, that decision had saved 340 Marines and proved that sometimes the most important battles are fought by those willing to stand alone for what they believe is right. The official records would show that the 340 Marines of the 2nd Battalion had been successfully evacuated during the withdrawal from Afghanistan. What those records wouldn't show was the price paid by one woman who refused to let bureaucratic failures cost American lives. Major Sarah Chun had proven that true leadership isn't about following orders. It's about doing what's right, regardless of the consequences.